Broadcasting from the commodity capital of the world, Zurich, Switzerland, this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
This edition to Insider's Guide to Energy is brought to you by Fidectis. Go to www.fidectis.com for more information.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is co-host Johan Oberg. Johan, what's happening?
Afternoon, Chris. Great Friday afternoon when we're recording this, and looking forward to another podcast. How are you doing?
I am doing fantastic because the weather in Switzerland finally has turned to spring, even though I think it's about summertime, but we're finally having nice weather. So it's hard to be in anything but a good mood. And I think we're going to talk about hydrogen today. That also puts me in a good mood. So great Friday afternoon for me.
I think hydrogen is something we've had it on the call a number of times in different kind of areas and different kind of topics, and it kind of cuts across quite a few of the things which I think is quite interesting. Some might be questionable. I wouldn't say controversial, but we have different views on certain things. So I think it's going to be an interesting discussion, especially when we bring on people that has a strong experience and also part of delivering the agenda around it, which I think is quite interesting.
So let's go ahead and dive into the show. I'd love to get right to the content because I think we've got a lot to cover today. So why don't you bring our guest on board?
Let's do it. So welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy, Andy Marsh, President CEO of Plug-Power.
Good afternoon, Johan. I guess it's afternoon there in Switzerland. It's still morning here in Albany, New York, but it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's definitely afternoon. I can see it's nice weather because you've got a beautiful background. As we always say on the show, we know a little bit about you. We had a few pre-calls. We had the opportunity to pre-read a little bit about yourself and also your company, Plug-Power, but our listeners might not. So why don't you give them a short introduction to yourself and also to Plug-Power?
So I'm one of the, I'm going to say, pioneers in the fuel cell and hydrogen industry. I didn't realize when I joined the company 15 years ago, I was going to be a pioneer. And as you know, Johan, pioneers are the ones who get all the arrows shot in their backs. But I've been the CEO of Plug since 2008. And we've really built the first commercial business in hydrogen and fuel cells. For that, I had a successful startup company. And before that, I worked 18 years at Bell Laboratories, which was at the time the premier research and development company in the world. Plug, over the last 15 years has grown from 1 million in commercial revenue to we'll do $1.4 billion today. We're building 500 tons of green hydrogen across the United States by 2025. Built a lot of fuel cells in our life, 60,000. Built a lot of hydrogen stations, 200. Have great cryogenic technologies. I think if you look at the whole hydrogen ecosystem, from electrolyzers for generating hydrogen to trailers and liquefiers to move hydrogen in liquid forms, to fueling stations, to the end use, we've done it all. And we do some of it by ourselves, and we do some of it with great partners like Renault and SK and Acciona. So that's kind of really a breakdown of Plug at a real high level.
So if I go back then, I just got one kind of wrap up that question. I hope, by the way, that as a pioneer, you not only get shot in the back, you also carry some glory. I certainly hope that's also part of being a pioneer. But
you know what, Johan, you talk about glory when you're 75 years old, not when you're building it.
I hope there were some good times on the way as well. But I'm interested because both Chris and I did I wouldn't say a career shift, but definitely an industry shift from the telco industry and from the software
Yeah.
industry into the energy industry. And it feels a little bit kind of the same in terms of a shift. So what made you start that pioneering journey? Was it 15
Yeah.
plus years ago?
I think, Chris, first, I am good at industries, and you don't like to brag, but I was in wireless in 1983 and broadband in 2001, and industries where have great growth potentials, as well as industries which are in the power segment, and that's really where I worked in telecom. Uh, I find quite energizing. I energizing that it's where my skills are. It's what I find fascinating is to create where there's nothing. And look, when you start thinking about, I know both of us are telecom veterans. When you start thinking about the opportunities in communication and what happened from 1983 to today, the opportunities in energy, I think, are 4 to 5 times much bigger than what we lived through previous in our life. So I think this opportunity has built something big and special. An industry just like wireless and broadband, which has had such a great impact on the world, it's really another opportunity to work on something that's special. And that's really why I'm here today and why I find plug in this industry just a fascinating journey. And it's so important to the future of the world.
You started the company, if I recall. I think you guys are from like about '97. If Plug is not a new entrant into this green world, you've been around for a while. Has it been a green company since the beginning? Because I mean, hydrogen's been in demand. There's been hydrogen. Hydrogen's also not a new molecule, right? We've had that, but green hydrogen is front and center of people's attention today. So has that always been your mission?
So, good question, Chris. So, the mission was really fuel. When I joined the company, it was really fuel cell oriented, and the company, had a vision that you would use hydrogen to create electricity, which underlines, underneath all that is a level of being green, right? Because you're eliminating combustion. But the company really, when I came to it, was a company that was rich in technology on the fuel cell side. And we were able to find a customer for fuel cells. And quite honestly, in 2008, it was difficult because what was the value proposition? And we were able to find with Walmart, working closely with Walmart, put fuel cells into forklift trucks. As I often say, not the sexiest industry in the world. But about a year or two into that, Walmart said to me, if you want to be successful, you need to provide the hydrogen fueling station, the hydrogen, and the aftermarket service. And that really kind of started. And at that time, I said to myself, Chris, well, I got to learn how to build hydrogen stations and source hydrogen because if we don't have any business. And so we learned to do that. And today, there's over 200 sites for people like Walmart and Amazon and Stiefel in Europe that are running from our fuel cells for those applications. Uh, I think 2016 and 2015, 2016, the Paris Accord, when the world decided they were going to really meet at that time 2 degrees C and now 1.5 and made commitments, that really became the journey where the company became more green. So we started developing all sorts of capabilities to be vertically integrated. We always wanted to be in hydrogen because, quite honestly, the large industrial players control pricing. If I was one of the large industrial players, I would be pricing as high as I could too. I don't see anything morally wrong with that. It's just the way markets are. But we thought to be successful, we needed to have our own destiny in hydrogen. And if you're going to start in 2017 to do that, why would you ever pick gray hydrogen, right? You know it only had a limited lifetime. So we made this commitment to be green. And when we had sufficient capital, we bought companies that could assist us in really accelerating our electrolyzer business, our cryogenics business. And that commitment really came out of the fact that it was clear to us our differential advantage was being a green company, that we had all the elements in place. And that's why we're building the plants in plants across here in the United States, and why we're building plants at the Port of Antwerp, why we're building hydrogen plants with Acciona in Spain. And this week, I just came back from Helsinki, where in Finland, we have grand ambitions to have over 2.2 gigawatts of electrolyzers deployed generating green hydrogen by 2030. So, which represents 5% of Europe's goals for 2030. So, we started out an American company, we became a European company, we started out a fuel cell company, and now we're a company that really supports the entire hydrogen ecosystem for the next generation.
So where is you talked about being a commercial guy and a market guy. So hydrogen's one of the drawbacks of hydrogen has been the market pricing and the viability of it at scale, right? So you just gave some examples of scale. You're talking about your company's doing things at scale, but overall, if I'm going to see hydrogen trucks on the road all over, if I'm going to see bunker fuel replaced perhaps with hydrogen or other use cases, what I've heard industry members say is just a cost thing, right? So the IRA, does that help it, or is there an impetus, or is there a catalyst that's changing it besides climate change at the moment for commercial side?
When you take a look, and Chris, let's take a step back and uh, think about what it costs to make green hydrogen and what it costs to transport green hydrogen. And, at a very high level, the IRA makes green hydrogen competitive with natural gas and gray hydrogen today. But the real purpose of those credits are, does it give you time to drive down the cost? And there are really three elements that are critical to the cost of the generation of green hydrogen. One is actually the cost of the equipment. And the cost of the equipment, I'm an engineer and I've gone through evolutions of cost downs. And here at Plug Power, we've been on what's technically called a learning curve, that every time we double the number of units in the field, our costs come down by 25%. And we've been on that learning track since 2008, and I can build these beautiful Excel spreadsheets that show the cost of the equipment at scale will be driven down and how it comes down. So the equipment portion of making electrolyzers cost effective with SMRs and other equipment doesn't really concern me. The two areas you have to think about are transporting hydrogen, and you have to think about the cost of electricity. And the cost of green hydrogen is closely tied to what the cost of renewables are. And today here in the States, we're able to do deals at 30 bucks a megawatt hour. That makes green hydrogen incredibly competitive with natural gas hydrogen. And I think you'll see, like the solar industry, that the cost of hydrogen is ultimately going to be lower cost than the traditional molecules, just because it's going to be driven by what the cost of renewables are. And when you look at our cost structure for building a hydrogen plant, 75% of the cost of $30 a megawatt hour is actually the electricity. And then you think about transport. And if you transport with pipelines like you do for natural gas, the cost will be about the same as moving natural gas today. There isn't really a huge technology jump. You just need to have pipelines. And our friends Fingrid in Finland are looking to build a hydrogen pipeline right into the heart of Central Europe. And there's similar programs going on in Denmark. And building hydrogen pipelines is not a new concept. So I believe green hydrogen will be competitive not only with gray hydrogen, but more importantly with natural gas. In Europe, it's actually much easier here in the United States to compete with natural gas. Your prices are a little bit higher.
Which brings me to a follow-up question on that one. I like the way the cost elements around this. You talked about the equipment, you talked about the transport, but also electricity. You mentioned Europe as well, which was quite interesting. And I read about the being Nordic is always a little bit extra when it comes out of the Nordics as well. But even if it's Finland, quite close to us in Sweden. But one thing that I thought around is when you look at this in scale and building out, you mentioned Spain as well, you mentioned Denmark. Do you see in your scalability, in your progress in terms of developing your business, are you picking the countries in terms of specific metrics in terms of low energy or better transport cost, or is it development areas? A little
Oh,
bit of
good,
insight on that.
really good question, Johan. And when you take a step back, you have to think through where renewable energy is available, where there's space available, and what the cost is going to be. And if you look at Finland, for example, 87% of the grid already is, I'm going to say, because I know it's a controversial item in Europe, whether you call nuclear power uh, renewable, but it is zero carbon. And 87% of that grid's already zero carbon. And when you go into certain areas of Finland, certainly northern Finland, you have cost structures which are very, very similar to the US. And so when one looks at that element, you have this great availability of renewable energy. I think maybe some of your readers noticed last week the cost of electricity actually was 0 cents at some times in Finland last week. That is a critical element. I think then can you transport? And when you have nations like Finland and Denmark so committed to putting pipelines into continental Europe that you have all the ingredients of how to move energy, how to create hydrogen cost competitively, and lots of land, right? It's these plants need a lot of land, and it's one of the reasons we think the Nordics, including Finland, is the best place to be in Europe. And then you have to think through, and we didn't talk about this, uh, stability. And one of my cautions about building plants in, say, Northern Africa and places like Tunisia is that if you're building in the Nordics, you have stable governments that have the same liberal democratic principles that all of us have. And you don't want to end up in a position like we have with Russia and natural gas. I mean, us in the US, Canada, Europe, South Korea, Japan, we really can't put ourselves in a position where dictators and fragile governments that don't have the same value systems we have are dictating how we live every day. So that's why I think the Nordics are the perfect place to be generating hydrogen. Spain doesn't. Spain we think is really attractive. Spain and Portugal. I think there are probably issues with land mass and probably more challenging building infrastructure in those two areas, but both are attractive areas.
You mentioned a lot of development, right? We just talked about Finland. We've seen a lot of development of your company in North America. So, are you leading the charge in changing the industry, or are you responding to demand?
Oh, we are. That's a good. You got me on a trick question there, Chris. Because if I say I'm not responding to demand, that's problematic, right? So I'm going to answer that question yes and yes. Uh, Plug is, without a doubt, has been the most aggressive company in the world building out this fuel cell and hydrogen industry. That being said, we haven't done it alone. If you look at what we've done in North America, it is really the relationships with end customers and end users. My biggest customer is Amazon. Amazon's already made commitments to buy 30 tons of green hydrogen from us a day, starting in 2024. These are people who are leaders. So we look at both. And I can't talk in detail about this today, but in Finland, you have a lot of energy intense industries. You take the steel industry, where 7% of the CO2 carbon in the world comes from that industry. A lot of those heavy industries are in the Nordics because they're places in which electricity is low cost, and so much of the end product costs electricity. So we do think about markets and customers and engage customers before we make those decisions. But we also want to be the first ones out of the gate. And we have continuously, during our 25-year history, even when revenue was low, really the first ones out of the gate.
And then from a North American perspective, since we're both from North America, where are we along the journey of, if we're looking 2025, 2030, 2050, how built out is the infrastructure? You mentioned pipelines in European countries. Pipelines are not real popular in North America. Building new pipelines doesn't really get the voting public excited. So how are we in infrastructure at home?
That's actually an interesting question, Chris. And during the past month, when the debt ceiling, I'm sure many of your listeners are probably trying to figure out why the U.S. would be talking about why they wouldn't be paying their bills. But during the debt ceiling, one of the items, I take a look at that bill, and it's actually was a real positive for us in the hydrogen fuel cell industry. What the Biden administration put into the IRA was continued. And one of the items that Senator Manchin made sure was in the bill based on his commitments with Senator Biden before was to make it easier building natural gas pipelines. So there is, and then I take a step back and it shows you that in reality, you had 200 Republicans who literally voted for the IRA when they voted for the debt ceiling bill because they did not touch the climate aspects. Hydrogen has not nearly been politically as a hot topic against with the Republicans as maybe solar and wind. And the Republicans are just as committed to making sure the U.S. has energy independence. And hydrogen really fits into places like West Virginia, Louisiana, Texas. So I think the U.S. is committed to having energy independence, and that includes the next generation, including renewables and hydrogen and green ammonia and green methanol, and that the infrastructure and the build out, I think you see so many of the announcements. The U.S. is taking a leadership, and I think the IRA is leveraging a combination of U.S.'s technology leadership coupled with the fact that we're leaning on Wall Street to help us build this all out. And the U.S. does best. I think if you go back even to the Gilded Ages, the U.S. does best when the government, industry work together to meet the future goals of the nation. So it's done a little bit different than Europe, but Wall Street is critical to the success of this build out, and quite honestly, companies like Plug.
So how's that? You mentioned a little bit in terms of the infrastructure around this. You talked about scale, but even if Plug is growing and scaling up in size and has been around for a long period of time, it's nothing you can do on your own. And connecting that also to the IRA in terms of developing this infrastructure. So maybe talk a little bit around the ecosystem that you're working with to make sure that this can actually be pulled through, because we see a lot of stories on the even bring on to this show where there's singularities of case studies that are very, very good, but once you start looking at scale, you need the ecosystem, and I know that that's something that you mentioned in the beginning. So maybe touch a little bit on that.
I think, Johan, that's a real, and during the journey that I've been on with the company, during the first 10 years, we quite honestly had to do everything on our own because no one was interested in this hydrogen and fuel cell space. Was not nearly the hot topic in 2016 as it is today. But we've recognized, and you can see from our partnerships, that we can't do it alone. If you take a look around the world, I mean, we're looking to build a large business in South Korea. We've established a relationship with SK, the second largest conglomerate in Korea, that has energy assets, has semiconductor assets, that will allow us to build by 2026 400 megawatts of stationary products, growing by 200 megawatts per year by 2030. And we really believe our large scale stationary becomes future peaker plants. And we're doing it real time with someone who really knows the energy industry. And we could not have done that with SK without. We're bringing technology to the game. They're bringing their market knowledge to the game and combining that. With Renault in France, we have products that have already been homologated with fuel cells. And again, Renault has great experience in electrification of vehicles, knows how to sell vehicles. That's not Plug's area of expertise, selling vans, but we have technology that helps. We have customers that want these products. And I think the combination, we're looking for those kind of combinations. And on the manufacturing front, we partnered with Johnson Matthey. We're looking to build a 10 gigawatt per year factory by 2025. Johnson Matthey brings MEA technology. We have probably today better electrolyzer MEA technologies, combining those forces together to really, and leveraging both of our relationships. And they have deep knowledge of precious metal, and especially recycling metals like platinum and iridium, which are really important for the future. And we're committed to doing this with people who have similar ambitions and can grow this pie as rapidly as possible.
So I guess, what is the legacy industry's opinion of what you're doing? So grid operators and folks providing legacy power, are you complementary to them? Are you competing with them? Because you said if you're making green hydrogen, you're using green resources to make your hydrogen. So how do you play in the ecosystem that exists today?
Uh, So I think most people are fairly sophisticated. And I think if you look at the oil industry, uh, people like Shell and Total are competitors, but there's many projects they do together. Uh, we're in a similar position where I'll I'll give you an example. Another great company, Linde. I buy hydrogen from Linde today. I sell them cryogenic trailers today. I will compete with Linde. I compete with Linde today for hydrogen sales. And it's going to be, I think everybody recognizes this pie is going to be so big that yes, sometimes you're a customer, sometimes you're a supplier, sometimes you're a partner. And I think that broadly it's across the industry that and I probably can give you 10 more examples where I work with people, I compete with people, and I buy from people. So I think those relationships, I think that's a normal business relationship. And you guys are from the telecom industry, and I worked at Lucent. We sold to Nortel. We bought from Nortel. We competed with Nortel. That's just life in large, big markets, and this industry is no different.
So when you talk about one thing I've always thought around, and we look at different application areas, and one of them being obviously transport, and we touched on that a little bit in terms of this one. what are your opinions? Because the way I see it sometimes is we have this discussion around hydrogen versus batteries or battery driven electrics, and we get different opinions from different people depending on what chair they're sitting on or who they represent or what last magazine they read or
Some of us
society.
are some of us are parochial, Johan, are you saying?
No, but for me there's two things around this. One, as a kind of the utility or the energy provider, how much stake do you have in this, or how much are you depending on where the actual OEMs are leaning towards? And also, if we drill it down to electric vehicles, i.e., your cars, where do you see hydrogen in the future of this? If you do, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can tell you where I think it. First, I don't believe cars are the right applications for hydrogen and fuel cells today. I think if you're using a vehicle 4% of the time, which is the standard profile for a vehicle, uh, and you can charge your car, I think electric vehicles are the best solution for users today. I think if you have an asset that you're using all the time and you need to keep that asset running continuously, and underneath it's actually why fuel cell forklift trucks work, because you can fill them more rapidly so you can keep that asset moving and you can leverage that asset better. You can go further. That's why when you look at the commercial state space, anything from like class 3 to class 8 vehicles, I think you can nod your head and say fuel cells or hybrid vehicles with fuel cells make the most sense. I do think that there comes a time around 2035, and a lot has to do with how the world evolves. If the world actually evolves to a sharing economy where cars become assets you want working all the time, fuel cells cars make a lot of sense and we'll have a bigger part of the pie. I also I firmly believe the right solution ultimately will be a hybrid vehicle, which will be fuel cells and batteries that will allow you the range. But also, and especially as fueling stations become more readily available, uh, I started looking at, and I've become more positive about fuel cell cars, or at least hybrid fuel cell cars. I was watching the evacuation of Florida from a hurricane. Luckily, you don't have too many of them in Switzerland. But I'm watching all these cars on the road, and I was scratching my head and saying, now, how's electric vehicles going to do that? To evacuate people in places like California and Florida during a crisis. And I sat back and said, boy, a hybrid fuel cell vehicle would be much better in those sort of circumstances. I think, if you are a family with one car, I think a hybrid fuel cell vehicle with fueling stations is going to be much better than a battery vehicle, because those times that you have to drive 300 or 400 miles. I have a guy who drives me down to Newark Airport, and he was telling me that he had one customer who had him drive his Tesla down back and forth, and he's had to stop 3 times to charge it in the 200 miles from here down to Newark Airport, and it took 20 minutes each time to put some charge on it. Um, it's pretty annoying for a trip that's really 6 hours. And so it's a little hilly profile. Chris, I know you were saying your dog's named Hudson after Hudson Valley. So you're going up and down in the Hudson Valley. And, I think there's going to be applications where hybrid fuel cell passenger vehicles will make a lot of sense.
But why
So,
don't you switch gears to where so vehicles are not your hot thing today. Potentially in the future, you think there's a fit for them.
passenger
Yeah.
vehicles.
So
Yeah.
so what are some of the best use cases? I heard you mention steel, which that seems to be an industry that people would want to do. And then maybe just color a little bit more where you see the uses today and where you see them growing.
So let's talk about the simplest places for green hydrogen Chris. It's where you're using gray hydrogen today. Fertilizer manufacturing, concrete manufacturing. Boy, they're pretty easy to say, let's take gray hydrogen and put green hydrogen in. That's pretty much a oil refinery processes. That's pretty easy. You don't have to do anything.
And what's the impact
And
of just doing that? Do you know, like for climate change, what kind of percentage of
like,
CO2 emissions
yeah,
reduced by doing
I
that?
can I can tell you it's probably it's 2% of world's energy, so it's probably in that range, just to give you, for the impact. And that's the easy ones. Then when you think about, I think when you think about asset intense vehicle applications, everything from class 3 to class 8 trucks, depending how they're using them. The vehicle, if you're using a vehicle 8 or 9 hours a day, boy, I think hydrogen vehicles are really a big part of the solution. I think things like ground support equipment at airports. I think,
When you say a
I
hydrogen
would say
vehicle, though, it's a hybrid, right? It's a hydrogen
it's
cell.
a
It's an
hybrid.
electrical
It's a
vehicle using hydrogen to make the electricity, right? So those would still be
you,
electric trucks running on hydrogen.
you got it. You got that exactly, Chris. That's a good way to, I look at it as you either have a battery or a fuel cell, or you have a battery and a fuel cell. And that's really how you make electric vehicles. And I think you touched on a good point. You really don't have to do a whole lot different. And even things like steel manufacturing, concrete manufacturing, and putting hydrogen in the natural gas pipeline. You really, if I have these applications where you have to do really nothing, where they use gray hydrogen today. Then you have applications where you just really have to make some substitutions in your process or your product. I think those applications make a lot of sense. And we're beginning also to see, Chris, a lot of demand for our stationary products at large scale, where they'll replace peaker plants, and we'll have, and I'm going to call it experiments going on, where you'll use electrolyzers to produce green hydrogen, store that green hydrogen, uh, and then putting that green hydrogen into via our stationary products to provide power to the grid, either during peak times when electricity are costly, or during times when you need electricity. So all those things are kind of a nice match for this industry. Do the easy things first, Chris. Do the things where you're mixing them, mixing technologies which are based on technologies that exist, and then you can move into the far sexier technologies that are like flying airplanes. I I also should highlight, Chris, that when you start thinking about things like green ammonia and green methanol, that's pretty easy PUDs too, which actually use existing infrastructure ultimately. So those are the sort of things I really believe in. Activities that you can do in the next couple years, not activities which are long term. That's really how you get this rolling fast.
So the Johan usually reserves the right to ask the dumb questions, but I'm going to ask it today just because I don't totally understand. So you talked about your trailer technology, the keeping things cold technology.
Oh yeah.
So what energy loss, and this is not trying to trip you up, I just don't understand. So you've got to basically, to transport it, you basically freeze it or get it very cold. So isn't there a cost to do that, and how does that weigh into the density and what we get out of a truckload of hydrogen?
Well, that's not a dumb question at all, Chris. It's a pretty critical question. And I would think about it no different than liquid natural gas, right? To liquefy natural gas, it takes energy. And to liquefy hydrogen, it takes about, you know, call it 9 kilowatt hours per kilogram. So you're thinking to myself, what the hell is he talking about, 9 kilowatt hours? It's about 20%, 25% of the energy that's in the hydrogen. So it does take a lot of energy to do that. but it is the only cost-effective way today to move hydrogen long distances. If you have to move it over 100 kilometers and you have to store it for a long time, liquid is really the only practical approach. But it's why pipelines are a better solution for 2030 type time frame for moving hydrogen. And you'll still have cryogenics available to make sure you have long-term storage available. But that cryogenic technology is really important during the next 25, 30 years to make sure you can store hydrogen and move hydrogen cost effectively.
So then, because Chris didn't have the stupid question, then I throw in the stupid question because we need to have that.
Okay.
Right? So,
so I'm the judge of whether questions are stupid or not.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. One of the things is that I just read recently, we mentioned it quickly, that Scandinavian Airlines just made out that 2028 they will have their first commercial airline with hydrogen. That means if this is going in the direction that Boeing and a few other airlines companies are looking for, that means that they need a lot of hydrogen on site at an airport, for example. We talked about transport costs, but what are the costs of actually producing everything on site, which we probably haven't been able to do with traditional energy sources? Is that an option, or is it still we produce it somewhere, we need to transport it?
So there's no reason, and I'm going to call on site within a certain area. There's no reason you can't, and we're doing this at places where, off the airport you could have electrolyzers generating hydrogen, have a small hydrogen pipeline into the airport and use that. You probably for flight will still have to liquefy it just because of it, depending how long the flight is. If it's a flight of any distance, because liquid state, you'll be able to have 3 to 4 times more energy than you have in non-liquid state. So you could need to have some sort of cryogenic technology, but that's not an outrageous thought to think that you can have local generation to support the activity. I think that's a very practical solution, Johan. And it depends if you're in a place like Dallas Fort Worth, where I know Airbus is looking at. Boy, that's a lot of land around Dallas Fort Worth. You can easily build a hydrogen plant around there. You could easily feed that into the airport and support all the needs. There may be some inner cities airports where that could be much more difficult.
Well, I think this was interesting, Chris. Any last thoughts from you? I have one more question I want to throw out, but I'll give you the opportunity to.
No,
By the way, you guys have not asked a dumb question yet, so you can't.
don't challenge Johan, please. No, I think I got a pretty good feel. I think it to me, what I was surprised when we first met Andy, and you can tell us a bit about your business and doing the research, is you're a lot bigger and more mature as an industry than you kind of hear when you listen to all the kind of the green talk and what's going on. So to me, it's pleasantly surprised to see the amount of infrastructure, the number of plants. When I go to your website and watch all the videos and all the cool things you guys are opening up, I find it pretty entertaining and interesting to see. So I think it's been an interesting conversation, but I want to hear Johan's last question before we say goodbye. So let me turn it back to you, Johan.
No, but I can just agree with Chris. I thought this is interesting. We've had discussions around this before, and doing the research, it was a little bit, okay, is this a scale-up company? Is this a startup company? And you start realizing this is at scale already. This is established, which I think is really interesting. And you mentioned as well that it's not just going to be one thing that's going to change this one. We need an ecosystem. The market is big enough almost for everyone. So I think from this show, what we're trying to do is also highlight that, because the more green energy, the more of this transition we get into the system, the better it is. But my last question is, I'm actually, because it's Friday afternoon here in Switzerland, I'm off to a dinner with an investor. later on tonight. And we always keep talking about what we do for a living. And unfortunately, I don't do the investment. I'm on a podcast. But Ben, what in your vision in terms of this around hydrogen and all the rest, and with the IRA, what should I tip him off of? What are the key moments of this for an investment? You mentioned Wall Street before. That's why I wanted to bring it up.
Sure. So I think Johan, an investor, has to decide whether he believes there's going to be a transition or not. Now, if you're a believer that the world can't be dependent upon fossil fuels, that you have to check that box. And if you're a believer that nations' policies are going to drive greater acceptance of renewable energy, and I think that whether companies meet their 2030 goals or 2035 goals, if they're plus or minus 2 or 3 years, it's not going to be that significant. When you start thinking about an industry that when you look at the modeling that's done by folks like Princeton, for example, which the IRA is built on, you can see that in the worst case, hydrogen's 15% of the world energy, and the best case, it's 25%. So this is an energy segment that's growing. And now to be Plug specific, here's a company that I believe that at the end will be viewed as the Amazon of the energy industry, that we are the disruptors. We're not afraid to do things. As you mentioned, Chris, you looked at the website and you saw, boy, these guys are building plants. These guys have customers. These guys are the largest users of liquid hydrogen in the world. They have a complete hydrogen ecosystems. They have factories and facilities to support folks. They have policies both here in the United States that matches their ambitions. There's, if you're looking at investing in high growth and don't get upset about the short term, about, the world's falling apart, there is not a better place to invest than in this renewable industry. And I can tell you, I'm here because I don't think there's a better place to invest than Plug, because as Chris says, we actually do things and been doing things for 15 years since I've joined the company. And we don't do it alone. We do it with great customers and great partners. And that's who Plug is.
I think that was a phenomenal final words from you. We got a little bit of the pitch for Plug as well. Thank you very much.
No, you didn't get it. You didn't get pitched for Plug, Johan.
I appreciate it.
I just gave you the reality.
Well, no, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great having you on, Andy. A pleasure to having you. And Chris, do you want to wrap up?
Well, yeah. Thank you, Andy. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show today.
Well, thank you I really enjoyed the discussion. And I think what you two guys are doing is very, very valuable to promote the renewable industry, because it is important for the future.
Thank you. For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this content as much as we did. It was a lot of fun making this episode. If you enjoy content like this, please don't forget to subscribe. Find us on Facebook, find us on YouTube, follow us, make comments, reach out to our guests, let them know what you think, and we're going to talk to you again next time. Bye-bye.